The political ends of the Uyghur narrative is something that the empire has admitted. This is a quote from, I'm going to read two quotes, one from Sybil Edmonds, who was a former interpreter with the FBI. She said that Xinjiang is the entry artery of energy. We want to gradually and internally play the gender card and the race card. For that part of the world, we want to play the minority without land. We say we are going to help them, and they are being oppressed. Chinese are gunning them down and torturing them. This was the plan. And then Lawrence Wilkerson, who is the chief of staff for the former Secretary of State Colin Powell, said in 2018 that the third reason why we were in Afghanistan is because there are 20 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang. The CIA would want to destabilize China, and that would be the best way to do it, to foment unrest and to join with those Uyghurs pushing the Han Chinese in Beijing from internal places rather than external.
Mira que ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, viva la revolución.
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
Speaking of people on the Western left who like to support imperialist propaganda about China, in particular the Uyghur community, I want to play a clip. This is from your favorite YouTuber. I'm sure you guys know him. He's somebody who you all love and respect dearly, Vash, and I say that sarcastically. Somebody who promotes this idea that China's carrying out a quote unquote genocide of the Uyghurs, that China is horrible, somebody who tries to act like they're on the left and is repeating State Department propaganda. I want to play this clip from his quote unquote Uyghur genocide research stream and get your reaction. This is something that, as those of us as Marxists who defend China, we get a lot of heat for. So I want to delve right into this topic. So I'm going to play this clip right now.
Using information gathered only through leaked documents from the Chinese government and official state broadcasts from the Chinese government, you can actually piece together more than enough information to make it perfectly clear that a genocide is taking place. The most charitable interpretation of what is taking place right now in the Xinjiang province in China is as follows. Over the past couple of years, a historically oppressed ethnic minority has been subjected to an astronomical rise in surveillance and policing. Not only has the government brought more police and more regulatory and surveilling programs to that region, additionally, they have enlisted literally millions of citizens in that province as essentially neighborhood watch organizers who work directly for the government, who are punished if they do not fulfill their duties, and whose job it is to be on the lookout for suspicious activity on the part of people within their region. That suspicious activity, and this is again the words of the Chinese government, does not constitute anything illegal. It does not have to involve illegal or criminal activity. It can be anything as light as being young. That's not a joke. Being young is a listed reason why it can be justified to announce that a person is suspicious and report their information to the state. Additionally, people in the Xinjiang province are forced to download an application which scans their phones for illicit or subversive material and uploads that information to servers held by the Chinese government. This is that area of the world, that area, Xinjiang, that province, is the hotbed of the cutting edge of surveillance state technology. There is, in all likelihood, no place on Earth more thoroughly surveilled. And all of this is done with the explicit intent on the part of the Chinese government to rid the Uyghur Muslim population of their extremist tendencies.
So it cut off a little bit at the end, but he said, basically accusing China of trying to rid people of their quote unquote extremist tendencies. Shout out to everybody who's watching and listening. By the way, Nadir Farah said, "Man, this guy full of lies," talking about Foch. Oliver Smith, Foch is a raging imperialist, a lie to the moon, saying he's another bootlicker, lieutenant of the State Department. Big Teal, not this guy, his lack of history and clear political ideology that can assist socialist projects gives me a headache. And this guy is somebody who has fucking hundreds of thousands of followers and all this stuff. So he's somebody who is really discussing and just repeating a lot of this State Department propaganda. Before I pass it over to you, comrades, to react, one thing that I think stands out to me is the fact, he talks about surveillance. And here's the thing, right? At the same time, we have to admit, like, yes, there is a genuine concern among Chinese officials about groups operating in Xinjiang and among the Uyghur community. But for legitimate concern, we have to remember that for several years that there have been already numerous terrorist attacks, bombings, stabbings that have taken place in China by not everyday working class Uyghur people, but by Western-backed Uyghur Wahhabi extremists who want to establish a caliphate and want to bring Sharia law into Western China and have killed innocent people. So it's not like the Chinese government is just like, look at them practicing their religion and following their traditions. We need to go get them and kill them for no reason. And that ties in perfectly with the Western racist stereotype of Chinese people just being bloodthirsty, killing people for no reason. That's the view that people in the West have of China, that the Chinese people don't value life, that they just kill a bunch of people and for no reason. What interest would they have in just wanting to get rid of them for no reason? It doesn't make sense. So I think that's something that for me is like, yeah, if you have a group of people in one region that are getting millions of dollars from the US and are stabbing innocent people in the subway and shit, like, of course you're going to keep an eye out on them. Obviously it's your natural right to self-defense. But Comrade Carlos, your reaction to that?
What we have to understand is that although this appears as a new issue, it is not new. The promotion of extremism to fight communism and socialism has been going on since the last few decades of the Cold War. And when the Soviet Union is overthrown, what the US does is shift its focus on using extremism to fight the Soviet Union, to shift it to fight China. So this is a long, broiling process, and I would recommend the listeners to check out an article, a compilation by Xiao Collective called Xinjiang, a Report and Resource Compilation. Now, one of the things that I wanted to mention is that there's so much of this information is fabricated, and they just toss so much shit at the wall. They create these institutes with these really bougie sounding objective names, Congress, the World Uyghur Congress, and Radio Free, and they create all of these plethora of institutes that are all funded from the State Department and the State Department forces and arms and shit. And what they end up doing is just citing all over Western media from these institutes that a lot of them get their information from Adrian Sens. Some of them get people that come from the Uyghur diaspora, and they pay them, and then the credibility is just completely, it's been thrown off a million times. They do similar things with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. But I want to note that this isn't like just us combating information anymore. The political ends of the Uyghur narrative is something that the empire has admitted. This is a quote from, I'm going to read two quotes, one from Sybil Edmonds, who was a former interpreter with the FBI. She said that Xinjiang is the entry artery of energy. We want to gradually and internally play the gender card and the race card. For that part of the world, we want to play the minority without land. We say we are going to help them, and they are being oppressed. Chinese are gunning them down and torturing them. This was the plan. And then Lawrence Wilkerson, who is the chief of staff for the former Secretary of State, Colin Powell, said in 2018 that the third reason why we were in Afghanistan is because there are 20 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang. The CIA would want to destabilize China, and that would be the best way to do it, to foment unrest and to join with those Uyghurs pushing the Han Chinese in Beijing from internal places rather than external. So we know the political ends of this, and this whole repression narrative, it's so hypocritical because as one of CGTV reporter Li Jingjing, I don't know if you guys know her. Her reporting is great. She mentions that the real genocide that has been, or the real cultural genocide and the real repression that has been going on in Xinjiang has been waged by the Muslim extremists, not by the government. They're the ones that have prevented the Uyghur people from expressing themselves culturally. They have prevented people from dressing in a certain way. They have prevented certain developments of traditional Uyghur music. There was a rock band that she was talking about that they were just repressing music, not allowing like the Uyghur musicians who wanted to incorporate some elements of rock music into the traditional. So they're repressing the development of Uyghur culture, and then they're repressing the freedoms that Uyghur women had won with the Chinese revolutionary process. So the real genocide, the real repression has been coming from these extremist forces that have been systematically funded by the US and not from China. What the Chinese government is doing is protecting the population against that. And poll after poll, when they ask Chinese citizens how they feel about these surveillance apparatuses, they're highly favorable of it in the mid to high 90s. And there's a reason. They see this as creating the sort of social conditions for accountability, for safety, and for the promotion of virtue. It's a lot easier if you're, a woman or a younger person to walk in the streets at night if you realize that the robbers or the people that have bad intentions know that they're being watched, right? So it promotes this aura of safety that has been seen by the population as mostly favorable.
Yeah, no, that's 100% true. And I'm glad you mentioned the Chiao Collective. They have great resources and content debunking a lot of this claim. And for those of you who are listening, this is a map. We're looking at a map of Xinjiang within its position in China. And I think it's also important to look at this from the position of military strategy, hybrid warfare, because one of the things that China has had difficulty with is that a lot of its cities are located on this East Coast, Beijing, Shanghai. And so Taiwan, the island of Taiwan, which is part of China, which also thankfully Nicaragua, maybe later on we could talk about that. Nicaragua has just recognized the PRC as legitimate China. Taiwan right here has always been a kind of a bastion, a rock in the shoe of China as a foothold of imperialism against mainland China. And also in terms of trading oil, bringing oil to China, it has been dependent on the coast. So with the Belt and Road Initiative and the brilliance of Xi Jinping and Chinese socialism, they have begun expanding westward toward Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, building highways, building corridors of economic development, reviving the old Silk Road of the 600 and 700s and creating a new, higher version, the new Silk Road, based on socialist cooperation. And it just so happens that Xinjiang is right at the artery, right at the conduit, the main base. It's like the jugular of the Belt and Road Initiative. So having control of this area is very important for US imperialism. It also borders Afghanistan, where we know that the US imperialists have engaged in opiate production and that the Sackler family and the big pharmaceuticals have been benefiting from producing opium. They would love to have Chinese people hooked on opiates again, just like in the Century of Humiliation. We know that Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan have a lot of oil production, trading with Russia and China. So geopolitically, Xinjiang is of strategic importance for the imperialists. And I think it's always important to kind of have that visual. Comrade Eddie, your reaction to some of the propaganda coming from our favorite YouTuber, Vosh, somebody who is just regurgitating State Department lies.
Yeah, no surprise to see that from Vosh there. He is a neoliberal masquerading as a socialist, as I'm sure most of your audience is already aware. But what he's talking about there with the increased surveillance, in a lot of ways is real. Like a lot of the information is fabricated, and coming from Adrian's ends. But then, one of the strategies of imperialism is to always blow out of proportion things that are real. Something really goes on the ground, and the U.S. blows it out of proportion and pretends it's something it's not. And that seems to be the case here. There was increased surveillance in response to these wave of terror attacks supported by the U.S., including the Urumqi riots, where over 100 people died, and there were people running around with severed heads in the streets. Like, people really underestimate how horrific these terrorist attacks were. And going back to what Carlos said of this being a traditional strategy of the empire in backing these right-wing extremist groups, the ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which is the major extremist group backed by the West, and driving a lot of the separatists and terror attacks in Xinjiang, were funded and supported by Osama bin Laden's Mujahideen, who the U.S. were arming and funding in Afghanistan when they were trying to stop Afghanistan from becoming a democratic, progressive society. So this not only, it has been continued to be supported by the U.S., as the U.S. has now taken the ETIM off of their list of terror groups, allowing the ETIM to continue recruitment. But it was also, the U.S. helped originate it. They have funded right-wing extremism all across the Muslim world for years. And there's a really good chapter of Vijay Prasad's book, Washington Bullets, called Hope Lay in the Muslim Revival. And that quote, Hope Lay in the Muslim Revival, is something that a CIA document said, because, they had said, we are going to target right-wing extremist groups, who are against socialism, against, progressive governments or ideals, against these countries developing themselves, in order to make sure that the U.S. maintains dominance in that region. And, now we're just seeing the latest iteration of that. But the left has the American left has no problem looking back historically and being like, yeah, funding the Mujahideen was bad. But, when it comes to modern events, and modern lies of the empire, it's much harder for these same people who can say the funding of the Mujahideen was bad to say the U.S. backing of the ETIM to destabilize China is bad. And they go right along with the propaganda. And, that's something I always say is everyone's an anti-imperialist in hindsight. Right? Everyone's an anti-imperialist 20 years later when we find out that the CIA was lying to us. But when the CIA is lying to us about Xinjiang, it's much tougher. And Carlos recommended the Chow Collective. Another one that I would recommend is Daniel Dumbrill. He lives in Shenzhen, China, and he takes trips to Xinjiang. He's also taken trips to Tibet. And he has these interviews where he interviews different spokespeople for the ETIM who are connected to the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is an arm of the U.S. State Department. And he gets them to say things like, they don't support women leaving the house without their husband's permission, or, they want laws that force women to cover a certain portion of their body. And you see what this is. It's just the NED and the State Department backing these right-wing people who want to destabilize China in order to destabilize China. And also just some of the reports that come out about Xinjiang are just absurd. There's a CNN report that says that China harvested 13 tons of Uyghur hair. They took a shipment that was leaving China. It was filled with wigs. They assumed that it was Uyghur hair harvested in forced labor camps and reported that all over the U.S. media. Harvesting 13 tons of hair would take 100 years. Hair is so light, it would be almost impossible to have forced labor camps where you harvest 13 tons of hair. But they just run these stories to create this general idea about China that they're, basically comic book villains.
Wow, that's crazy. And the crazy, it reminds me of the fake stories that come out about the DPRK, that all these crazy stuff that everybody has to get the same haircut and all this nonsense and propaganda that they say about the DPRK. And as long as, because of lingering racism as well, people will believe it. They'll say, wow, these people are crazy. They're just barbaric. They're this or that. And it's really disgusting to see how the U.S. imperialists lie about China so openly and nobody. And I'm really glad you mentioned that people are anti-imperialist in hindsight, because I remember I don't know if you guys remember this, but in 2013, when Obama was president still, there was so much talk around Syria, and everything was Assad is gassing his own people. Assad is gassing his own people, chemical weapons. And around that time period, I was already becoming a communist, but it was interesting to see so many people on the left who believed it, who they were like neither Damascus nor Washington, or they were kind of pulling that shit, right? And they were saying like, oh, but democracy now said it, so it must be real, right? And it's like so much propaganda and lies about Assad and chemical weapons, which doesn't even make sense. Why the fuck would he just wake up one day and decide to gas and attack his own people for no reason and try to get away with it? And then I remember, I don't know if you guys remember this as well, but there was that image of that young boy in Syria who was covered in dust and covered in smoke. And CNN and MSNBC and all these imperialist outlets are like, oh my God, this poor boy, we have to go in and save them. And the US has to save the Syrian people. And people fell for it hook, line, and sinker. It turns out that that whole shit was staged, that somebody put him there, and his family was Assad supporters. That it wasn't even the Assad government that was doing that. It was the opposition, and that they totally warped that whole narrative to serve the aims of imperialism. And it's nothing new. We've seen that as well with the Gulf War, right? With that girl who was saying that the babies in the incubators were thrown out, and it was revealed that she was working for some high royal family and intelligence. So all these, and the second I say that, people, all these like soy liberals like Vosh, they're like, here we go, conspiracy theory. It's like, no, dude, like that shit happens all the time, bro. Like psychological operations, they do that shit in order to justify war, because the best way that imperialism can justify war is tapping into empathy, tapping into the emotions you have. And by creating this narrative, right? Because the US is not gonna have support for war if they're like, we need to squash China and go in there and show them who's boss in America. That doesn't work anymore. So now you have to pull on the heartstrings of the masses and be like, look, these people are dying, and if we don't go and save them, more are gonna die. Do you want blood on your hands? And that's exactly what they're doing with China. So and as Joe, the Euro squatter, said, the little girl was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, IIRC.